So, welcome to this chapter. On this chapter, we have a couple of videos coming ahead, and we'll be looking at digestive system. And as always, I've divided the content into few sections. We'll start by looking at the important structures that make up the digestive system. Prior to that, I'll mention a couple of just general notes. But these structures include reviewing not just the anatomy, but as we go through that, we'll see also physiological aspects. So maybe that plan that you see on the screen is a little bit misleading in a sense that physiology is not covered completely on its own section, but it's kind of intertwined. As we learn about anatomy, we also see the physiological characteristics that are possible because of that anatomy and the anatomy that's needed to facilitate that physiology. So we'll talk first a little bit about a concept that I've mentioned in the past in passing in terms of anatomical locations. We'll look at peritoneum. Then we'll talk also about the mouth region. We'll spend a little bit more time on that, looking at different structures within the mouth, understanding its function, understanding, for example, saliva, salivary glands, to highlight some of the important ones. Then we'll talk about pharynx and esophagus. We'll also talk about stomach. We'll look at different regions of the stomach. We'll look at valves that are involved, and we'll talk about secretions. And that secretions really does tie into that physiology a big time. Then we will review small intestines, and while we're reviewing the three parts of the small intestines, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, we'll also talk about accessory glands that are located on this area. So we'll talk about pancreas, liver, and gallbladder. We'll finish our journey looking at the large intestines, especially I'll mention cecum, appendix, colon, and rectum. But in all reality, we will finish off by looking to the very end of the digestive channel, also to the anus. So that's the plan for this first video together. And like I said, I really want to get us started by thinking of that big picture. Why do we need digestive system? What are the roles of the digestive system? So why don't we just make a start with that? So digestive system, interestingly, is one continuous tube. I believe that the tube is, there's a little bit of variation from one individual to another, but about 9 meters in length on average. So if my conversions work out correctly, I think that that adds up to about 30 feet in length. So this tube starts at the mouth and it ends at the other end at the anal opening. And I've kind of tried to schematically illustrate that continuous tube there on this sketch-like diagram. So you'll see that in this representation, the human body is that blob, and you'll see that this tube goes through that blob. Of course, it's going to be inside there, so it should be kind of like a faded tube within there. But what I really want to highlight that when we have stuff inside, and I'm saying that inside in quotation marks, when we have stuff going through the digestive system, inside the digestive system, technically it's not really inside the body, since this tube is still connected from both ends to the external world. So material is just traveling through that tube. It hasn't yet crossed inside the body. So that's the first important theme for us to be familiar with, because it's really going to help us to understand some of the concepts that are coming up in just a little bit. And when we think of the functions of the digestive system, I really want to return to this formula of cellular respiration that you can see at the very top of the screen. And from this formula, the portion that we're focusing in on is that your digestive system provides the energy to drive those body processes and provides nutrients that serve as those building blocks for the body. Obviously here I'm showing sugar, glucose molecule, but that's just symbolizing that it could be many different things. So now that we have a kind of basic idea of a shared ground, so to speak, of what I want us to focus, let's have a look of the list of functions for the digestive system that I've listed below there. So the first function that I've highlighted is the digestive system allows us to take in food, and this is known as ingestion. The final function that I've shown in this list is that, of course, digestive system is important also for eliminating indigestible material. So this could be, for example, fiber that we have on diet. We still need it on things that we eat. We need fiber for two main reasons. First of all, to move things along in that digestive tract, and then as a bulk to feel full. So for example, your stomach will sense whether it's full or not, and that will control whether you feel hungry or not. Those were the two ends of this list of functions that I've listed, and I've kind of symbolized on that schematic diagram with those arrows and other structures. But let's focus on the two middle bullet points that I have on this slide. And what we see is that the food that we consume is typically too large in terms of the sizes of molecules, even after all the chewing and so on, for it to pass into the body proper. And by that I mean pass from this tube that's inside the body to across those membranes, actually to the body itself. So these large molecules, for that reason, must be broken down into smaller molecules, and this process is known as digestion. And we're seeing it symbolized on that diagram as we're taking this larger food molecule inside that tube and we're breaking it apart into many smaller molecules. That process was digestion. The second process that we're seeing on this diagram is these smaller molecules that we have now broken the food into. These now can pass into the body proper. So this would mean that they pass to the capillaries, blood vessel capillaries at the abdomen, and also lymphatic vessels for those larger fat molecules. So this process where these smaller molecules move across from inside this tube to actual inside the body, that process is known as absorption. So I hope that those terms make sense. I hope it adds up because it is going to be an important distinction between digestion and absorption that we want to be clear of. So now that we've had a look of that, let's look at that structure that's been kind of popping up in our discussions when I've been describing locations of other body parts, especially on abdominal area. And this structure is going to be our peritoneum. So we often locate structures within abdominal cavity in relation to the peritoneum. And peritoneum is a serous membrane, basically a connective tissue layer that surrounds the abdominal cavity and also anchors some structures within it. And we can then name structures in relation to the peritoneum. Where are they in proportion or in relation to the peritoneum? So retroperitoneal structures would be located behind the peritoneum. I think the kidneys are a particularly good example there. Intraperitoneal structures are within the peritoneum. So one example that we could highlight from this diagram that we see would be, for example, our stomach. Then we also have sub-peritoneal structures. These are below the peritoneum, and I think a good example of that would be, for example, our urinary bladder. So really, a lot of the time in anatomy and physiology, it is a matter of learning these basic terms, and you'll see that we build up on those. So I hope that that's going to be helpful in kind of shedding light to those discussions that we've had before. So now that we have all of this basis that we've established, I think we're ready to move on and actually look at the digestive system and different parts of the digestive system. And digestive system can be divided into two parts. So we're going to see that the first part is going to be the alimentary canal, or sometimes it's called gastrointestinal tract. And I often abbreviate it as a GI tract or GI canal. This is a one continuous coiled hollow tube that starts again at the mouth, ends at the anus, and at certain parts, this tube gets more wider, at certain parts more narrow, certain parts we have sphincters controlling the movement, but it is a continuous tube. And the organs within the GI tract are responsible for ingestion, digestion, absorption, and defecating. We've seen all of those just earlier on when we looked at the main functions of the digestive tract. But that's not all that digestive tract is. The second set of structures that we see in the digestive tract are going to be our accessory organs. These accessory organs assist us in the digestive functions in many different ways. These could include, but by no means are limited, for example, producing secretions that help us with the process of digestion and help us with moving materials along within this tube. So I hope that that makes sense and kind of lays out a little bit of expectation of the structures that we will be looking in this chapter. Before we dive in to talk about these individual structures, though, I want to spend a quick moment of showing something that I find always interesting about anatomy and physiology. We saw a similar theme when we talked about blood vessels, that there were many different kinds of blood vessels, but these different kinds of blood vessels actually shared general wall structure. And this is very much the case also in our GI tract. So we see 4 layers at all parts of this digestive tract. So let's have a look of that. So the 4 layers at all parts of digestive tract, which was this one continuous tube, are going to be on the screen, and we're going to go through them from the innermost, so from the inside the tube, and then work our way out through those wall layers. So let's have a look of that. The innermost layer is known as mucosa. And mucosa facilitates a really easy passage across it. So we might need to do absorption, so taking the food matter from the tube and have it enter the body proper. But we also do secretion through this layer. Interestingly enough, it is not that the glands typically are located within this mucosal layer, but the ducts of the glands certainly are located there. In addition, the mucosal layer protects the GI tract wall in other parts. So we'll see sometimes, for example, we eat things and we don't want it to scrape the digestive tract. So often this mucosa also provides that protection for the wall structure. The second layer that we're going to see is going to be our submucosa. The name literally tells us that it's located below the mucosa. This is our control layer. This is where we'll see, for example, glands. We'll see blood vessels, we see nerves, so a lot of regulation of what's going to happen inside that digestive tract. The third layer, moving further in, is going to be actually made of sublayers, and this is going to be our muscular layer. This is made of smooth muscle layers, and the fiber orientation of these layers varies. So the innermost fibers are circular fibers, so they really surround the digestive tract. You could think of them as kind of controlling the diameter. For example, many sphincters would be falling into this group, regulating the passage of materials through this tube, through this tract. And the outer muscle fibers that we typically see are longitudinal muscle fibers, so they run along the tube's length. There is going to be a third layer, but this third layer we can only see in one structure of the digestive tract, and that's only at the stomach. And these are going to be our oblique muscle fibers. layers. And this is because stomach does so much mixing of the material inside it. So we have this additional layer. So we really do the movements to all directions within the stomach to ensure that the contents within there are really well mixed. The final layer that I'm going to show here is going to be our serosa, the outermost layer. It anchors the GI tract, adds strength to it, and so on. I also have this very nice diagram here on the screen showing more anatomical illustration of these 4 layers. If you kind of want to see it instead of that schematic representation that I provided more kind of accurately in terms of anatomy. So that's available for you to have a look as well. Now, I think we're ready to go through the different parts of the digestive tract, one structure by structure, and we're going to start at the mouth. And mouth has many functions. I'm going to highlight especially mastication, so the process of chewing, salivation, and also the sensory reception, so the taste. We want to scream what's coming in to the body. So let's have a look next at thing that I think is interesting. So we should define the boundaries of the mouth. And by the way, on that slide, you can see that sometimes we see terms like oral cavity or buccal cavity being used to describe this region. So the boundaries of the mouth can be defined anteriorly, laterally, superiorly, inferiorly, and posteriorly. And I think this is a good chance for us to practice our directional terms that you've learned before and put the kind of boundaries for this space that we're looking at. So anteriorly, of course, the boundary is going to be our lips, laterally cheeks, superiorly our palate. So we have anteriorly hard palate because there's bone inside it, and posteriorly soft palate. There's no bone inside it. It actually turns then into uvula. Inferiorly, the mouth is defined by our tongue, and posteriorly by oropharynx. So now that we have those terms and those boundaries clear, we can kind of look at what's happening in the mouth in a little bit more detail. And let's look at a term called vestibule. Vestibule is a term that comes from Latin, referring to chamber. And this is the space between the teeth and the gums and the lips, really the space where I think that people on dental field would be working at. Another important structure from the mouth that I want to talk about is going to be our tongue. Tongue is a group of skeletal muscle bundles. Some of them control the shape of the tongue, and some of them control the position of the tongue. And tongue really serves many different purposes, functions for us. For example, mixing the masticated, so chewed with teeth, the masticated food with saliva. So when the kind of chewed down food gets mixed with saliva, we no longer call that food. It is now called bolus. So bolus is this kind of a wet ball-like structure of a mixture of chewed down food and saliva that's then easier to manipulate, swallow, and so on. On that note, tongue also initiates the swallowing process by pushing the food or pushing really the bolus to the back of the mouth, and that's how we can then swallow. Another structure that I wanted to highlight from the mouth is known as frenulum. And these are connective tissue bands, and we see them in few different locations. First of all, we see lingual frenulum, which runs underneath the tongue. So you can see it really nicely on that diagram. On some people it's more pronounced, on some people less pronounced. In addition to that, we have 2 other locations where we see frenulum. So we have a frenulum running between the teeth and gums and lips, both at the lower and upper jaw. And in fact, sometimes we see on newborns issues with these babies latching, and because the frenulum is too pronounced, and we might need to cut it. Same thing if you're going to dental field, that I think might be interesting for you is that sometimes we have patients whose front teeth are not coming together, and this might be sometimes due to pronounced frenulum, and again we would then cut it to allow these teeth to come together anteriorly, if that's something that the patient is interested in. Interestingly enough, I had a great discussion with a student who shared with me a little bit of her expertise of the frenulum. Prominent frenulum is actually a genetic dominant trait. And in the history of mankind, if we think about this, when babies had very prominent frenulum and it prevented them from latching, they just historically died due to not being able to suckle that milk. But now that we can cut it off, it actually, this gene, prominent gene for very prominent frenulum, so dominant gene for it, has become more and more common because of this medical treatment. So we're seeing also how our care that we provide for the patients is changing the genetic pool of our people and our population. So rather interesting thought to ponder about. I also wanted to highlight from this diagram the uvula. This is continuation of the soft palate, hang the dangly bit at the very back, and like I said, it plays important role in the swallowing process. As we continue our review of the mouth, I think this is a good time for us to talk a little bit about saliva. Saliva serves many different functions. Saliva contains an enzyme known as salivary amylase, and salivary amylase is responsible for breaking down starches. In addition, saliva has a role in creating the sense of taste that we can perceive. It also forms this moist bolus that we talked about, the mixture of mechanically broken down food and saliva. So that's essential to form this kind of a moist, round blob that's then easier to swallow. And finally, saliva also plays important role in cleaning our mouth. For example, when you eat chewing gum, it's not really the chewing gum that traps the particles. Chewing gum makes you salivate more, which it will then consequently clean your mouth and hopefully prevent cavity formation because bacteria don't get to feast with those leftover particles. We will focus on this course on the major extrinsic salivary glands. So let's have a look through those. And I wanted to start with parotid salivary gland. Parotid salivary gland is located here next to the ear on top of the masseter muscle, which you might remember from the past. And the duct from the parotid salivary gland opens next to the second upper molar. How I often describe to my students who are having hard time remembering the parotid salivary gland, to think of pirates, and their parrot sits on their shoulder, where the parrot would be where your parotid salivary gland is. So the saliva produced by parotid salivary gland is actually very watery and runny. This is not really related, but I'll mention it. Sometimes we can have, for example, cancer of the parotid salivary gland. Operating on that is a little dangerous or a little tricky for us because your facial nerve runs through here, so we need to be mindful of that as well. Let's look next our submandibular salivary gland. Submandibular salivary gland is located medially to the mandible at the jawbone, and it has ducts that open on both sides next to the base of the lingual frenulum, that structure connective band that we just looked. And if you have a friend or a classmate or someone else who's willing to lift their tongue up so you can see those two small holes, those small holes right next to the lingual frenulum at the base would be where the submandibular saliva comes out. Secretions from submandibular salivary gland are mixture of both this watery and mucosa secretion. And then we get to our sublingual salivary gland. The name really tells us it's found underneath the tongue. We'll see many ducts from the sublingual salivary gland that open to the floor of the mouth, and the saliva produced from here is very thick, mucousy in its composition. So now that we're familiar with that structure, we're still going to stay within the mouth region, and I think we're next going to focus on teeth. And you will end up with two sets of teeth. Initially, between when you're 6 months and all the way till you're about 2.5 years old, you will have your primary teeth erupting. So your milk teeth from the jawbone and through the gums. There's going to be 20 of those. And then when you turn starting from age 6 all the way to teens, even late teens, you develop your permanent teeth. So the second set of dentition pushes the milk teeth out of the ways and appears, and this is going to be 32 teeth in total. And they enlarge and develop below the milk teeth and then erupt, like I mentioned. So this is why I tell my students who are going to dental field that it is very much a good field. We live longer than ever before. We don't get the third set of teeth even though we live longer. So really there is a need to take care of the teeth. There is a great demand for those services. We can study the teeth, but my students find it easier if we divide teeth or we divide the mouth into 4 sections. So quadrants, and we study one quadrant and teeth in that. And then if you learn that, you can just rotate it as a mirror image to other quadrants. So most anteriorly and also most medially, you will find your incisors. There's going to be 2 of those per quadrant. These are really chisel-shaped teeth, ideal for things like biting into apple. Then you're going to have 1 canine per quadrant. This is a sharp teeth, ideal for things like tearing meat. You're also going to see 2 premolars, or they're also known sometimes as bicuspids. These are kind of transitional teeth moving, and we'll see more of their characteristics also when we look at the next set of teeth, which is going to be finally more posteriorly and more laterally. We'll see 3 molars. These are large, flat-surfaced, powerful teeth because they are located there where the powerful muscles of mastication bring them together. So they're ideal for things like crushing and grinding material in between them. So that really completes our review of the structure of the mouth. And now that we're familiar with that, I think we're ready to move on to the next set of structures. Next structure that I want to look at is going to be our pharynx. This is a skeletal muscle structure, a passageway that's shared between the food and fluids and the airway. Obviously, we're not interested in digestive system about the nasopharynx, but we definitely see oro and laryngopharynx that are of an interest to us. Oropharynx behind the oral cavity and laryngopharynx below the oropharynx, and then continues downstream as an esophagus. Those were the parts that we shared between respiratory system and digestive system. At this point, I really quickly wanted to just show the concept of swallowing. The fancy word for swallowing is deglutition. And this is both voluntary and involuntary process. So it starts as a voluntary process, and once it has been initiated, it becomes an involuntary process. And notice here on this diagram that's really nice, the bolus, this mixture of mechanically broken down food and saliva that's formed at the mouth. Then tongue pushes it to the back of the mouth. And as it does so, the uvula seals off the nasal cavity, so protecting that negative experience of having food or liquids going up there. And throat kind of, if you look at the diagram, almost jumps up to receive this bolus. At the same time, epiglottis seals off the trachea, a respiratory pathway, and then the bolus continues down this tube, down the esophagus to the stomach. So rather nice set of pictures there for us to familiarize ourselves with. So let's continue with that esophagus and have a look of that. The British spelling is with an O in front of it, American spelling with just an E. So that's why you might hear me mentioning it differently than what you're used to. Esophagus is a smooth muscle tube that carries the foods and liquids from the pharynx to the stomach. It is, in fact, one of the very few structures that penetrate through the diaphragm muscle that separated the thoracic and abdominal cavity. Others that I can think of would be your aorta and inferior vena cava. Esophagus is typically squeezed closed when it's not used, so we prevent those negative experiences of acid reflux or air entering to the stomach. What's interesting to many of my students is that esophagus is actually able to carry foods and liquids because it's this muscular tube, even against gravity. And this is because of a movement known as peristalsis. So if you ever tried, you could stand on your head and drink a glass of water, and would still the water travel from your mouth to your stomach thanks to this peristaltic movement. So let's have a look of peristalsis and compare that to the other type of movement that we see sometimes in the tubes, or contraction that we see in the digestive tract tube, known as segmentation. So peristalsis is when we have a muscular tube, and the muscle fibers that make up that muscular tube contract in a very synchronized manner, that once one muscle fiber contracts, the one immediately next to it contracts as well, followed by one immediately next to it, and another and another. And by doing this, we're able to move material along this digestive tube, for example, in this example, our esophagus. So we're creating a net movement. An analog that I often give to my students is to think of a toothpaste tube and how you can work from one end of that tube towards the other tube. So you're moving materials along. That would be a good analog for peristalsis. But that's not the only type of contraction that can take place in muscular tubes. We also can have a movement known as segmentation. In segmentation, again, we have this muscular tube, but rather than being as coordinated, these contractions don't happen next to each other. They happen here and there. And this really serves only two main purposes. It serves a little bit to mechanically break down material in there, in that very portion where the contraction happens, but also locally mixing it back and forth, but there's no really true net movement on that tube. So that was our segmentation. The example that I give for that for my students is, think of someone who grabs a toothpaste tube and squeezes it from the middle. It doesn't really move the toothpaste greatly along that tube. So now that we've had a look of esophagus, let's have a look of stomach. Stomach is this C-shaped pouch located on the left side of the abdominal cavity. And let's start from the bottom of this slide. I want to make sure, so we saw that food is what you ate, then it became a bolus once it was mechanically broken down and mixed with saliva. When this bolus enters to the stomach and gets mixed with stomach acid, it becomes now chyme. Chyme is this watery or liquidy mixture, really runny compared to that bolus, which was more of a ball-like structure. Often students think of stomach as this kind of rounded balloon-shaped structure, but in reality it's much more often not fully distended, so it's kind of like an empty balloon, so to speak. There's a great amount of stretching from when the stomach is empty, that would be about half a liter in contents, to when it's full, which could be all the way up to 4 liters of contents. I think that that's about 1 gallon, the 4 liters. So the stretching of the stomach is in fact possible thanks to structures known as rugae. These rugae are folds in the inner lining of the stomach, and definitely worthwhile characteristic to notice in terms of facilitating that stretching and shrinking of the stomach based on its needs, how full it is. Then, now I think that we're ready to look at different portions of the stomach. The stomach can be divided in different regions. So first we'll see cardia on this diagram, kind of that turquoise color. This is the portion where the esophagus joins the stomach. So that's the junction area, cardia area. And then we have fundus, that's kind of an orangey color on this picture. It's the uppermost part of the stomach. This is where the gases build up. We especially see the gases building up there in medical imaging, so that might be something to keep in mind. Other thing to notice is that when you get that need to burp, it might be that there's gases there, and we're really trying to bring that fundus down so that the air could leak out. Majority of the stomach, which is shown on yellow color on this diagram, is known as body of the stomach, so that's the main part. Often common in terminology when we name structures, body is the largest part. And then distally at the very end, before we get to the small intestines, we'll also see pylorus, red on this diagram. That's the end part before we get to the small intestines. Pylorus can be actually subdivided into pyloric antrum and canal, but you don't need to worry about that. Just know it as a pylorus. I also wanted to talk about two sphincters that we see with the stomach. They're symbolized on this diagram as those kind of pink circles. We're going to start from the top. Sphincter known as lower esophageal sphincter, or I think that textbooks often call it also cardioesophageal sphincter. This is a sphincter that separates the esophagus from the stomach at the level of cardia. It prevents us from having heartburn, which is really when the stomach acids climb up to the esophagus and irritate that wall lining there. We also see pyloric sphincter at the very distal end of the stomach. This controls the flow of the chyme from the stomach to the small intestines. So we see those two sphincters. Interestingly, the lower esophageal sphincter is more of a physiological sphincter, not an anatomical sphincter, but you can definitely find an anatomical pyloric sphincter at the distal end before small intestines. Let's look at the stomach wall and lining, and that helps us to understand about secretions. So a stomach wall is made of simple columnar epithelia, and within it we see these dips known as gastric pits. And at the bottom of these dips we will find gastric glands. And these gastric glands produce gastric juice. And in fact, you end up producing about 3 liters of gastric juice per day. So let's unbundle those secretions of the stomach a little bit further. And this is one of my favorite slides. I know it looks busy, but let's go through it step by step. We're seeing a lot of important stomach secretions here. So let's start by looking at pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is secreted from the chief cells. This is in an inactive form, and it becomes activated under the effect of stomach acid. Then pepsinogen is converted into pepsin. This pepsin now is responsible for splitting proteins. So this protein splitting process happens already, the digestion of proteins within the level of stomach. That's possible because of that acidity of the stomach acids being able to activate the pepsin into pepsinogen, or pepsinogen into pepsin. Let's next have a look of gastric lipase. Gastric lipase is secreted from our chief cells. And the word lipase makes you probably think of lipids, so this splits fats. But interestingly, gastric lipase is very weak in its ability to function because of the acidity of the stomach. So it's not until we leave the stomach and gastric lipase leaves with the chyme and gets the chyme gets neutralized within the small intestines that the gastric lipase can really start to act and function in that splitting fats. So within the stomach, gastric lipase remains in a weak form, doesn't do a lot of digestion there. We have already mentioned the stomach acid. It's secreted from the parietal cells. I also want to mention mucus. This is secreted both from goblet cells but also from the mucus glands. This is important in forming this thick inner lining of the stomach wall that really prevents us from self-digesting ourselves with the stomach acids. So we have this mucus layer protecting the wall. And finally, I wanted to mention intrinsic factor, which is secreted from parietal cells. This plays an important role in vitamin B12 absorption. So now that we've gone through the stomach, I think it's a good time for us to have a look of small intestines. And small intestines, they vary in length about, let's say, 2 to 3 meters in length. I think if my conversions work out correctly, that's somewhere between 7 and 13 feet in length. It is, in fact, the longest part of the digestive tract. And notice that this is the main site for nutrient and energy absorption within the digestive tract. And this is because once the acidic stomach contents, so chyme, enters here to the small intestines, this chyme gets neutralized in terms of its pH. And now, since it's more neutral, most digestive enzymes can kick in and start working optimally. We also see that this fact that it's the main site of absorption is due to the fact that we have such a large surface area due to these many microscopic folds of the small intestine wall lining. In fact, if we spread it out, all of the small intestines wall lining flat, that would cover more than an entire tennis court in surface area. So you really see having that large surface area is important for us to do that, that absorption of the nutrients and energy. And when we talk about small intestines, I definitely want to make sure that we mention the three parts of the small intestines. So we have our duodenum, that's the first 25 centimeters of the small intestines that kind of wraps around the pancreas. We have our jejunum and we have our ileum. Sometimes my students are like, how am I going to remember these? The mnemonic that I give them for that is DJ il. Think of a DJ that plays really sick music. So duodenum, jejunum, and ileum were the parts. Where jejunum ends, ileum starts, there's not really clear transition zone. It's more of a concept. So let's look a little more why chemical digestion gets going on in the small intestine. I already mentioned that, but we can unbundle further. And that takes us to talk about the accessory organs that we see in this area. So let's start with pancreas. Pancreas is soft tissue extending from duodenum towards the left lateral wall of the abdominal cavity. It is both endo and exocrine gland. We've talked about the endocrine role of the pancreas in those hormones that regulate blood sugar, glucagon, and insulin. We saw those earlier on. Our interest now is on the exocrine function of the pancreas, and the exocrine function is to produce pancreatic juice. This is released to the duodenum via hepatopancreatic ampulla, so this little hole, little opening, through which secretions both from the pancreas and also from the liver and gallbladder enter to the duodenum. These secretions, the pancreatic juice, neutralizes the acidity of the stomach contents, so the kind that has now entered from the stomach to the duodenum. And this allows the digestive enzymes to start working optimally, like I mentioned earlier on. And this is the reason why small intestines is the main site of absorption of the materials. I also want to mention liver. This is our largest gland in the body, located at the right upper quadrant, just below the diaphragm. It consists of 4 lobes. So liver has many different roles: detoxification, removing old blood cells, energy storage are some that my students would mention. But the important one for us when we think of digestive system is the production of bile. Bile is this yellow-green watery solution. The color actually comes from the bile pigment that we have in this mixture. And the purpose of bile is to emulsify fats. And what I mean by saying that it emulsifies fats is that it breaks down fats. Interestingly, even though liver produces the bile, bile is not typically released directly to the duodenum. Instead, it goes to gallbladder. Gallbladder is this green sac found in the shallow fossa of the inferior surface of the liver. When there's no material actively at the duodenum, bile tends to travel there, build up here, get stored, and also get concentrated. So then when there is fatty food at duodenum, the contents from the gallbladder, the bile from the gallbladder are released, and this bile helps with breaking down those fats for the absorption that will then follow. So that's why individuals who get their gallbladder removed often are not able to digest largely heavily fatty foods, so they try to avoid those diets because we don't store that bile. It just trickles all the time to the small intestines and duodenum. We don't have that storage for when it's needed to be released. Let's have a look. Next are large intestines. Large intestines is not as long as the small intestines, but larger, I guess, in a sense that when it comes to the diameter of this portion. It runs from the junction of the small intestines, some ileocecal opening at the right lower quadrant of this abdominal cavity, and it runs from there all the way to the anus, so the opening to the external world. At this part, the main function is really to take back to the body the water and electrolytes. And whatever is left now, it's no longer chyme. Once we've removed the water, electrolytes, nutrients, it's going to be now feces. And we will look at the different parts of the large intestines next. Let's start with cecum. Cecum is the sac-like first part of the large intestines. And from there we see hanging appendix from. We can sometimes see that appendix can become inflamed, appendicitis. We'll talk about that a little bit more. We've already, at the kind of pathological section of the content, we've already talked about appendix in our previous videos. I also wanted to mention colon. Colon is the most prominent part of large intestines. We're going to see 4 portions there. So ascending colon travels up on the right side of the abdominal cavity and makes a turn at the right colic or hepatic flexure. Then we have transverse colon that travels across the abdominal cavity at its superior portion from the right to the left and makes a turn at the left colic or splenic flexure. Then we have descending colon that travels down on the left side of the abdominal cavity. And finally, sigmoid colon, which makes this S-shaped curvature at the very, very end, distal end, entering to the pelvis. I also wanted to mention rectum, which holds feces until they're ready to be relieved. And then, of course, our anal canal and anus, which is serving the opening of the large intestines and delivering the non-digestible material that was now called feces to the external world. And I think that that nicely brings us to the very end of reviewing the main structures of the digestive system. I know it's been a lot of information. This has been a little longer type of a video, but I think it's been a very useful exercise. In the next video, we'll wrap up rest of the content that I wanted to cover on this video. So until then, thank you and bye.